Well, good morning, Boardman. Great to see you guys here, and happy Mother's Day to all of our moms out there. My mom is still back in South Africa, so it's about 8 hours ahead, so I had to get up really early to wish her for the day. I actually cheated and did it last night, so I did wish my mom, which was great. I always love Mother's Day Sundays because people, dress up a little bit and actually come to church for a time to act like when your mom comes in from out of town, like you come to church every single week. And moms, if you want to know if your kids really come to church, just come and talk to me afterwards. I'll tell you how often they're here, just so that you know. I always love it when they're like, hey, I'd like to introduce you to my mom, and I will say, I don't even know who you are. So that can always be quite fun. Hopefully you guys saw the photo booth around kind of towards the restrooms back there. That is something that we do at all of our campuses for Mother's Day. It is a free service to you guys, and so you can go and do some great things. It sends you the pictures right to your cell phones. Just amazing what technology can do. And so hopefully you'll take advantage of that after the service. If you haven't done so already, we really just want you to feel welcomed here as well. Some of us, I'm still blessed because my mom is still around. I know some of you have lost your moms along the way. Maybe for some of you in a few years, you will be moms. And maybe for others, it was an unrealized dream in your life. And so we really just want to celebrate wherever you're at today, just for all of our mothers. I read this quote the other day, and I thought it was really good. It says, moms, they must be a resident psychologist, a physician, a theologian, an educator, a nurse, a chef, a taxi driver, a fire marshal, an MMA referee, and the occasional police officer. And I thought that's probably a great description of that. I remember my mom said this years ago that we lived in a home where my dad worked and provided for our family, would leave early in the morning, would come home late at night, and mom was the one who kind of did everything else in between. And so she would sign us up for events, and she would make sure we had our uniforms, that those were clean, and that we had food and snacks and all kinds of stuff. And she said, I still remember you would go and play soccer on a Saturday morning, and you would dribble the ball down, maybe even go and score a goal, and then you'd be so excited, and you turn around on the sidelines, and you go, did you see me, Dad? Did you see me? Did you see me? And I think that moms sometimes feel they fill a quiet role a lot of times. And most of us that have had some success in our lives, a lot of it is attributed to our moms as well. One of the things that we like to do as a church, we love trying to support missions around the world and everywhere. And so moms, today, in honor of you, we are donating $3,000 to the Contact Mission, which is a place in Romania. They're building a children's wing on a part of their church. And so that is what we are giving today in honor of you. So thank you, moms, for who you are and for what you ultimately do. Today we're starting a new sermon series called So Others May Know. And it's a series out of a letter at the end of the Bible in a collection of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Now, if you read the Bible and you read the Gospels, there's a lot of Johns in the Bible, and so sometimes it can be hard. Is this John the Baptist? Is this somebody else? No, Jesus calls a disciple, a follower. One of his disciples is named John. And he's described in the Gospels as the disciple that Jesus loved. Now, it doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't love the other disciples or the other followers. It just means that he's kind of part of the elite crew, the inner circle. There's a lot of times where you see Jesus takes 3 of the guys along with him. Their names are Peter, James, and John. This is the same John that writes the gospel, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He's also the same John that writes the book of Revelation, the last book in our Bibles. And then about 5 books back from the end, we have these 3 letters called 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Now, 1st John's actually more of a sermon, and then 2nd John and 3rd John, which are just about a page each, are sort of commenting on what he has already said and just reinforcing what he has ultimately said. We do know about John that he is the last living disciple. He lives till he's about 95 years old, and he dies in exile. Where in a world that most people live they don't make it out of their 30s and their 40s, he lives until 95 years old, and he is the last writer of the New Testament. He's the guy that gives us the last little bit, the gospel, these 3 letters, and the book of Revelation right at the end. And he is sharing with us the story of God. He's reinforcing one more time who Jesus is and ultimately what Jesus is doing. He's writing the last little piece that he ultimately wants us to hear. Now, this book is called 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, not to be confused with the gospel, are called epistles. Now, it's kind of a weird word. It's from Greek and Latin. It basically means knowledge, and it talks about the idea of he wants to share something. He wants to impart one last thing to the people that he's writing to. He wants to tell them something. In fact, it's called traditionally, or the definition is, a formal letter, often written to a large audience for the purpose of instruction. He wants to tell them one last thing. And our Bible has a ton of epistles in it. Most of them are just named for towns or cities that they were written to. Like the book of Galatians is written to the church in Galatia. And Ephesus is Ephesians. And, Thessalonica is where the book of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are written to. Most of the epistles have the name of the place that they were written to. But John does something different. These books at the end of the Bible, they're written with his namesake, right? 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. It's not an ego thing for him. It's about who's writing them. But it ultimately is for everybody who has ears to hear, that now that he is close to the end of his story, he's going to encourage them about some valuable and meaningful things. And there's kind of an underlying question in these Gospels, and it's maybe one that we ask today as well, and it's this: are we true believers? Do we really believe that Jesus was who he said he was, and that the story that we have about him genuinely is a story worth following in our lives? He wants us to make sure that we know ultimately not only who Jesus is, but what he came to do and how we respond to it. As I was looking at the theme of this series called So Others May Know, it reminded me of some historical things about 150 years ago, as people were making their way from our shores and going into deeper, fishing grounds as boats got bigger and people were able to do those things. There was this group of people that named themselves, they were called the Guardians of the Sea. Now, the name didn't quite stick, and so it kind of got changed and edited a bit. Today, we call them the Coast Guard. The name's still kind of in there. But in the early days, their motto, their mission statement, what they were trying to do was summed up in 4 simple words. And they're actually very similar to these words. Their words were not so others may know. Their words were so others may live. But it means the same thing, right? If we live in a way that others know, they will find life in Jesus because of that. It didn't necessarily mean that they would always lose their lives by saving another, but they were willing to do that. They were willing to step out onto the threshold. Several years ago, there was a movie made called The Guardian. It starred Kevin Costner as kind of a rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard, and he had a lifetime of incredible and epic stories. And as he had faced maybe one too many injuries, they sent him back to become the trainer of the next class of recruits. And this is where you meet the character played by Ashton Kutcher, who he is a new candidate, and he wants to be a rescue swimmer in the Coast Guard. And a lot of the story is about what they do and how they believe. But a lot of it has to do with what happens between the two of them and the relationship that they form and the way that life moves forward because of that, so that others may live. John's also going to pose a question, and he's going to ask this idea of assurance, not insurance, assurance. If we really believe that the story that we read about Jesus is true, does it fill our lives with anxiety that we're never going to be good enough, or does it fill us with peace and joy, knowing that we believe in something that is bigger than us and is not ultimately about us, but is about him? And so as we begin in 1 John chapter 1, this is not the gospel, this is the one at the end of the book. I want to show you what this ultimately says. John starts with the proverbial we, even though he's writing it, but he's writing it from a community perspective, isn't he? We proclaim to you the one who existed from the beginning. Now this is obviously talking about someone else. He's not proclaiming about himself. I'm proclaiming to you the one, namely Jesus, who was there from the beginning. John is obsessed with this idea of the beginning. In fact, if you read his gospel, he starts there as well. He doesn't just start in the middle of the story. He always ties it back ultimately to the beginning. If we jump over to his gospel, John chapter 1 and verse 1, he says, "In the beginning, the Word existed." And you notice word is capitalized, right? If we unpack this a little bit, we know that word is not an expression. It is actually a person. It is the animated presence of God that we come to know as Jesus. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. What John is going to do in all of his writings is he's going to point to this idea that something happened at the beginning. I think sometimes in church we think Jesus was plan B, right? God tried everything else. He tried to lead the people out of Egypt. He tried to give them the law. He tried to give them their own town and their city and their temple, and nothing worked. And so one day he threw up his hands and he said, "Well, I guess I'll send Jesus." That's not the story that John tells. John says Jesus was always plan A. He was never plan B. 1 John 1, verses 1 through 3. Let's walk through this a little bit here. He says, "We proclaim to you the one who existed from the beginning, whom we have seen and heard." That's important. We're not proclaiming some idea or something that we didn't have hands-on experience with. We're proclaiming from the position of what we have heard and what we have seen. We saw him with our own eyes, and John's probably one of the last people who can remember actually seeing Jesus. And we touched him with our own hands. This is an eyewitness account. He is the Word of life. The one who is life itself was revealed to us, and we have seen him. Not just a person who was a good guy or better than the people around him, but the person that embodied the very essence of life. And now we testify and proclaim to you that he is the one who is eternal life. He was with the Father, and then he was revealed to us. That's the story that everybody wants to know and that everybody wants to see. You know, we live in a world where we've always got to talk about proving things, or we talk about evidence, and we kind of get lost in some of these stories. We've learned to treat stories with suspicion rather than trust. Isn't it amazing when somebody comes and tells you something, our first response often is, "What's wrong with this story?" Not, "Can I believe this story?" We kind of have twisted things in our world ultimately. And we don't generally start by believing where people are. And this is what's happening even in John's time. It's been 50, 60, 70 years since Jesus has walked the earth, and people are wondering, is this story going to last? Was it just here for a time and then is going to move on? You see, in the movie The Guardian, what you learn as the story unfolds is that Ashton Kutcher had a very bright future. He was part of a high school swim team that was second to none, and they were heading for the top. They were heading for the championships. And he could write his ticket anywhere that he wanted to go. But one fateful night, he and his swim crowd, they go to a party, and he is the designated driver. And even though he does not partake in anything, and after everything takes place, he is completely absolved of any wrongdoing. They get into an accident that's not his fault, and it kills all of his teammates except for him. And he carries this, a man that had a bright future. Now he wants to go and be a rescue swimmer. And this question is, why would he possibly want to do that when he could have done absolutely anything? You see, the problem is that he has to decide if he is going to believe the truth or if he's going to believe a lie, even if it's a lie that he has told himself. What we tell ourselves defines who we are. And sometimes we don't know the power of those things. We have to figure out what's true and what's a lie. When we're going through the Gospel of John and doing the story on the miracles, it's kind of cool with the miracles that Jesus does in the Gospel of John. He turns water to wine, and then he heals some guy's son, and then he heals a man by the pool, and the stories kind of go on a little bit, raises Lazarus eventually. But there's a story in John chapter 9 where there's a blind man that comes to Jesus. And he wants to see. And so Jesus spits on the ground and makes mud and puts it on the man's eye. It's kind of a gross story, I'm going to admit. And then tells the man to go wash his eyes, and he does that. And then there's this huge debacle that emerges with all the religious leaders because they don't know who Jesus is. And they can't explain this. And people are asking them these difficult questions. And so they're getting rattled. And then they call this man in, and he's about 30 years old. And then that doesn't work, so they call his parents in. And then they start arguing amongst themselves. And they're like, who is Jesus? Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? What does that mean for us? Do we need to protect the institution? And there's this huge thing that happens. I love the man's response in verse 25 of John 9. When they finally bring him in, he says, I don't know who this guy is. I don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy, but let me break it down for you as simply as I can. I was blind, and now I can see. That's the easiest way I can tell you that. And the story that emerges as a result of that is rather interesting and defining, shall we say. In our world today, we deal with something every single day that I believe is getting worse and worse and worse, but it's always been there. It's this idea of subjective versus objective truth. Objective truth is easy. Objective truth is like gravity or seasons, that things come alive in spring and die in the winter. Or like the fact that the sun comes up from the same direction and goes down in the same direction every single day. That nothing we can do can hinder the night from coming, and nothing that we do can make it day again. We understand objective truths. They're beyond us. They're outside of us. But there's a bit of a miscommunication about what subjective truth actually is. Subjective obviously means it's about us. I think in our world what we've made it mean is, well, that's not true to me. That's not what subjective truth is. Subjective truth is how you engage truth. It's not you deciding what you think is true or not true. There's an element of that, but that's not the biggest part. It's about when we are confronted with a story, how do we engage or incorporate that into our lives? In years of counseling with people, when somebody would come in and say, I feel angry or I feel sad, I would never say, do you even know what that is? Let's look it up. Let's just trace the etymology of what that really means, and we'll decide if that's actually the emotion that you're experiencing. No, we start with where people are. If they identify, I'm dealing with something, and I feel this is what's happening, that's where we start with people, right? For those of you that have kids, and I know many of you do, we have two girls, one who is kind of a neat freak, and one who loves Jesus very much. But dumpster fire is the best description when you walk into her room. And I don't want to sell my kids out, they're good kids. But Emery needs to get her life together, okay? She really does. And then she'll give us the argument, right? I know where everything is in my room, right? You get that one? Okay. You've done this before. Hey, you need to clean your room. And then you'll get some pushback. Why do I need to clean my room? And sometimes you just have to say, because I'm your dad, or because I'm your mom, and I told you to. Now, nowhere in the history of the world has a child in that moment said, I'm going to need a DNA proof that you're actually my parent before I accept what you're saying. Actually, that's not true. There have been children that have done that. We just can't find them anymore. That's really where we are. One of the hardest truths that people have to confront, and this is a hard one, is we have to get to a point in our lives where we realize that Jesus did not come to heal us. Jesus came to save us. And most of the people that are detractors of church, it usually has something to do with this idea of brokenness or unhealed trauma in our lives. If God is so good and so powerful, then why are there children who are starving? Why does poverty exist? Why do people kill each other? If God is so good and so real, then why does He allow these things to happen? Need I remind you that in the story of Eden, God created a world that they could share in and partake in. And He said, it's yours. You can eat everything in the garden, except one thing, right? Violence did not enter the world until a brother went against a brother. These qualities are our struggles, not God's. God did not infuse those things into our world. We did. And so I always think it's funny that people will say, why are there starving people? Why is there so much homelessness in our world? Why is there so much violence? When is God going to do something about it? And then God looks at us and he says, when are you? And this is what John is getting at. God, why don't you care? And maybe he would say, why don't you? This is why the man's response to this miracle is so profound. He just says, look, I don't know all the ins and outs of everything, but I know that I couldn't see, and now I can see. And what I'm seeing is Jesus, and I'm going to live in a different way because of who Jesus is. And maybe in the midst of that, there is a definition, if there ever was one, about what faith is. Faith is when the unexplainable meets the undeniable. That's what this man is sharing. I can't explain to you what has happened, but I also cannot deny what has taken place in my life. You see, sometimes we want to look at Jesus as the scientific theorem. And we're going to say, we got to prove all these things before we can believe the story. And that's not the reason why the story was written. I'm not saying that there's nothing that we should prove or nothing that we should test. But faith is more about the experience that we have in our lives. It's less about making sure that everything lines up exactly the way that we think it should. There's a lot that we're not told. And at some point, we have to take it on faith. And maybe if we have true integrity, the question is this: am I willing to doubt my doubts? Am I willing to say, hey, not everything that I believe lines up with everything that should? Maybe there's some things in my life that I've believed just because I've believed them for a long time. And maybe if I have some intellectual integrity, I can stand back from that and approach it a little differently and realize that I don't know everything about everything, but that at some point I'm going to have to trust something beyond myself. 1 John 1, verses 3 and 4, he continues here, and he uses a word that we don't actually know is a religious word. We use it in other ways. He says, we proclaim to you what we ourselves have actually seen and heard, so that you may have fellowship with us. The word fellowship is not just about community or being engaged with other people like we are right now. It's saying that our story lines up behind God, not because we have all the answers, but because we choose that story to be a part of our lives. And John is calling the people and he's saying, listen, we're all the same. I love what Mark said today. We take communion with people at other campuses, people all over the world. I mean, my parents took communion, 8 hours ago. And in a way, I get to share that with them. That's what fellowship is ultimately about. It's about great connection. It's not just about sitting in one place. And John is trying to show that. We're all in this together. And he says, and our fellowship is with God and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And we are writing these things so that you may fully share our joy. Notice what he says. He doesn't say, we're writing these things so that you can know more. We're writing these things so you can have better answers or something else. He's calling them to say that when the story becomes real, it has a personal and emotional effect on our lives. And that when we take ourselves out of that realm of being antagonistic towards God and allow it in, it'll change maybe the way that we live. I heard a story of a woman recently who went to her pastor. She was kind of new to church, and he encouraged her to read through the Bible in a year. And so she did. And she said it was really weird. I got to the end, and I completed it, and I finished it, and I thought it would feel different. I thought I would feel elated and encouraged, and that I would just be like, wow. And she said that didn't happen. And I actually felt quite depressed and low because I was like, why did that not happen? And she went back to her pastor and she said, I read the whole Bible, but it didn't feel the way that I thought it would feel. And he said to her, okay, I want you to read through the Bible again this year, but this time, instead of looking for yourself, I want you to look for God. She said it drastically changed the way that she saw the story. We will never see God if we're only looking for ourselves. That's why there's a moment in faith where you have to give yourself to something more than yourself. I've told people for a long time, and maybe from my own perspective, if you're the biggest thing in your story, that's a pretty sad story. And yet our world tells you that you need to be the biggest thing in your story. And that's what John's really saying. You've got to give yourself to something more. You've got to give yourself to something greater, to something better. That's why in the midst of this, if I could find that pocket, there you go. That's why in the midst of this, we're talking about this idea of so that others may know. Others will never know unless we show them, not unless we tell them, unless we show them. Because John is going to say multiple times that when we know Jesus and that affects the way that we live, others will follow that story and they will find life that they've never had before. In the movie The Guardian, after the character played by Ashton Kutcher, after he's dealt with some of his demons, something shifts in his life. You see, in the beginning of the story, he wanted to be a rescue swimmer because he felt the guilt and the shame of others losing their lives while he kept his. And so in many ways, he was trying to throw his life away as an act of surrender, to fall on his own sword, so to speak. But as the story unfolds and a new narrative starts to take hold of his life, instead of throwing it away, he begins giving it away and pouring it out into the lives of others. And he starts saving other people's lives because he realizes that he himself has been saved by other people. He stops believing the lie and he starts stepping towards the truth. And with all Hollywood movies, for dramatic effect, or maybe because the story is still close to the truth in a lot of ways, there's a moment where they're all called out on a big save. And there's an encounter between Kevin Costner and Ashton Kutcher, the master and the student. And only one can be saved. And so the master does what the master does. The master gives his life so another may live. And in that moment, he pours himself out into the one that comes after him with the charge that he will do the same. That's what John's doing. He's saying, I got to see this. I got to experience it. And I'm going to pour my life, my last words out into you. And then you're going to pour them out into someone else, and someone else, and someone else. And the only reason we're sitting here today is because that chain was never broken. Amen. That somebody poured their life into yours. And our charge is to pour our lives into others. We become the eyewitnesses. We become the remnants. We become the holders of the presence of God, and we live our lives in a way so that others may know him and that others will find life. So, Father, today, we just thank you so much for inviting us to be a part of this story. Thank you for the way that you love us so unconditionally and so completely. And Father, sometimes we believe the lies. Sometimes we think that we're too far gone, that there's nothing we could do to come back to you, that we've made so many bad decisions we could never make enough right decisions. And God, we know that those are just lies of the enemy, and that all you call us to is a pledge to say, I will take up the mantle, and I will create space in my life for the presence of God to flow. And I will take that and I will allow it to affect me. And as I live my life, I will try to pour my life out into others. So, Father, today we just thank you for that gift. We start with gratitude, that you're a God who loves us, who created us in love, who sacrificed in love, who gave us everything that we could never deserve. And we pray this in Jesus' name. And the church together says,